then some will probably roll in around 5.
Yeah. He announced it Sunday 17 times.
What's that? You don't want to be seen? Oh. Right here, I'll face it that way. It really is just. I don't even know if anyone watches these. It's more just a record. That's fine. I believe last week. Actually, let's pause and pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and all of the blessings and misfortunes found therein. And we ask that you would give us the strength to put our trust in you in all things. We thank you for the world that you've created and ask that you would open our eyes and our understanding to that world, that it might be seen through the vision that you would have us see and understand. We pray these things in your son's name. Last week, I know we kind of ended, and I was looking over the list of verses, and I don't know, I don't necessarily, given the constraint of our time today, want to go necessarily back. But if you did want an overview of sort of where the figure of Satan or the accuser, how they conceptualize that appearing in the New Testament, I can go back, but otherwise I'll move on. We can talk about that later. Is that okay? Demons are actually probably even a bigger subject. You know, it's funny when we talked about angels, but when really angels are really, or the whole celestial hierarchy, are part of Christianity. So that's a slice of Christianity. Then you get into the figure of Satan, and that also too is a slice of Christianity, but a big one, because that figure of evil or the accuser, or this sort of malevolent figure, is something that is characterized in all sorts of cultures. And when you get into the category of demons, and it gets much wider, because demons can mean a lot of different things. Yeah.
I thought about what you were saying last week, and you keep referring to Satan as the accuser. Why is he called that?
That's just what literally Satan means. It means the accuser.
And how does he do that?
It really is looked at in both in Hebrew and in Greek terms, in their translations, as in a sort of judicial or legal setting. So, but the idea of it, just what it means as an accuser, just someone who comes against or opposes an adversary, but is interpreted as the accuser in particular because of the way it's used in Job. But here's the thing again, as we talked about, I think it was last week, that there is no evidence that the accuser in Job is of any sort of evil form, and there is a reasonable place to understand that actually is an angel of God. That is, there are angels of destruction, or angels of forces that we deem, and that's also the important thing to remember is, given where we're at in our culture, we deem things okay, not okay. Like, in other words, our perception of the world changes throughout time, and so our understanding also of these things changes throughout time, and that actually is probably most illustrated. The movement of even the notion of demons goes from a very low. What's interesting, just sort of as an overview, the Old Testament does not really acknowledge demons in the same way the New Testament does. In fact, there are only 2 instances, and we'll look at those, of where in the Old Testament some form of the word demon is there, and as we'll look at it in a moment, the actual structure of the word is not necessarily a I can't have a hard time saying that word for some reason. Malevolent, there you go, or evil or sinister sort of character. You just don't have that. And then there is influences, as we'll talk about, from Zoroastrianism during the time of captivity between Israel and Persia. And that influence is ultimately what gave them a more robust view of demons. And then it's really interesting. You can kind of see it get woven into the New Testament. And when you have the Greek idea mixed with the Zoroastrian idea, you kind of, and then it birthed within Christianity in particular in a new day and age where like it was as full and robust as it would ever have, Peter, that's what I credit Peter's striking down Ananias and Sapphira to, the power of the Spirit and his inability to control it. again, if you look at the whole thing from a celestial world being, and as we look at some of the powers of demons, same sort of thing. The same way we looked at the celestial angelic beings that were at God's command or Christ's command, how they could change water into wine or stop the storm or calm the storm. Again, was that Christ actually speaking to the elements of the universe, or was it Christ commanding the angels to control the elements of the universe? Over the last month, I've become more convinced of the latter. Yeah, Jim.
Even in the Bible, when he's tempted by the devil,
Yeah.
Doesn't he say, tell your angels to come and take care of you?
Yeah.
Or and to catch you and to, so wouldn't that go into that?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole, and it's, and just another word for all of this, this is where we're talking about the cosmology of all existence, how the cosmos, not the cosmos includes us in it. So when we talk about cosmology, this is the cosmology of different views of, and granted, I mean, throughout time it changes and morphs, but of demonology and what are demons. And what's interesting about it is demons, I would argue, after looking at today, are a more primitive understanding of the evil or of the spirit world, or maybe the first understanding of the spirit world. And you know, they supposedly date it back to the paleo something ethic period, where, and again, this is buying into some notion of evolution, where Neanderthals were fearful, and that fear turns into the notion of a spirit being, you know, when you see a dark cavern, you think an evil spirit's in there because you have fear of it. Now there could be nothing in that dark cavern. I mean, it could be, you know, it could be a neat, clean cave that's nice, habitable. It'd be great. But just because it's dark, there's a fear that wells up in us, and that fear affects our emotions. It affects our intellectual capacities, and so the very idea of a demon or of an evil force is very primitive. The idea of a monolithic or a monotheistic God like Yahweh that is above all other deities and gods and divine powers in the world is a radical notion at the time where Judaism comes about. Because there is, even if you had one area of ancient Near East, they would have their gods, but they wouldn't completely deny the other gods of another land. Because their cosmology of gods were that these were, and we'll talk about this in a second, the evil spirits. These were gods that were inhabited. And I'm honestly, after really looking at all this stuff, I'm to the place where I'm thinking there probably were a lot of really, if it's true, if we truly are buying into the idea that Christ was controlling the elements through angels and celestial beings, and demons, as we'll find out, were given dominion on this world, and therefore also some have the capacity to manipulate the material world. And so why not? Why couldn't Pharaoh's magicians change rods into serpents? Because it wasn't the magicians, again, it was the evil spirits. So in other words, that sense of power or ability was granted to all. Anyway, let's go through some of this stuff. I want to look at a number of things just to sort of to build I want to look generally what's one of the larger categories of what a demon is. And then I'm going to skip ahead of my notes, and I'm going to actually want to look at where do demons come from, just as sort of a base. And that will primarily be from the perspective of a Christian, because there are countless, I mean, every culture in human civilization has some notion of an evil spirit, except for, like, you know, capitalist Wall Street. Outside of that culture, but I mean, you can't, I mean, you know, even atheists or pagans still have some sense of spirit, you know, and innate, and I think it takes just as much, you know, hubris to believe in atheism as it does to believe in Christianity. So it's kind of like, welcome to the club, you're just choosing the opposite side of it. But that idea that there is some sort of force. So we're going to look at where we as Christians sort of offer claims to where they came from. I want to look at the development kind of from the time of the formation of Israel up through Christianity, and somewhat up through the last 2,000 years of the church, to understand how we view demons. And then I'll summarize just with maybe a practical way of looking at them in our everyday life. Does that sound palatable? We'll do that all in 23 minutes. Or some little more than that. Okay. Demon. It's a word that we hear, we don't use often. You know, I grew up in Ohio, Kings Island, Demon Drop. It was one of those first straight drop ones. It was a great roller coaster. Demons are associated with negativity. We don't often talk about demons in terms of a personification in as much as a buffoon sort of way, you know, like a jesterish sort of character like Satan, as we talked about last week with the tales. We see them as sort of generally minions of the devil, ones that sort of do the bidding, but they don't necessarily perhaps have the will of their own. They're always sort of in servitude to someone else. In general, if you look up demon, you'll get a malevolent, supernatural, non-physical entity. It's kind of a general or a squished definition of a couple terms. So it's malevolent.
Man.
Malevolent. M-A-L, I thought. Malevolent. Devious, supernatural. So supernatural meaning not necessarily of the natural world, meaning the physical world that we live in. Also non-physical, and this will come into play because in many of the definitions throughout history, you have an embodiment or a possession that are associated with demons. In other words, they don't have physical bodies themselves, but they animate themselves through both human and potentially animal, or even, you know, by controlling the elements, non-human form, but a real entity. They are present in every form of cultural folklore from the history of time. So everyone has this notion. There is a sort of differentiation between various traditions between a devil, the idea, kind of in the same way that Satan is. Satan as a general accuser or a category of a demonic force, or a demon, a devil and demon in the same way. Sometimes people interpret devil and demon in sort of synonymously, and there's a reason for that. I wrote it down. I don't remember. Someone wrote it and switched it over, and then it sort of influenced it. Maybe I'll remember. And then the notion of devils, which is probably more commonplace throughout history, the idea that devils are a class or of demons, and sometimes it's viewed as devils are sort of the manager of a class of demons. So that when demons do their work, they're doing it on behalf of the devil. And if you find out the cosmology that there's one ultimate evil force and the idea of Satan, then all of these devils would be then subjected to the ultimate dark force, which would be Satan. So if you want to do a crude hierarchy, one ultimate figure of Satan, devils that operate or function. And here's the other thing, is really when we get into it, the idea of is when we go back to that celestial beings of the angels, the idea of dominions and powers, that those could have also fallen in those ranks too. But again, we don't, you know, when Paul says our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against dominions and rulers and powers of this world. Well, are those just interchangeable words that Paul was using? Or are those levels of demonic forces? Jim?
When did it come into the fact that Satan or the demons were trying to capture something?
Well, that actually goes back to, and give me 1 second, and I'll come around to that because that actually comes out in some of the Egyptian demonology that sort of forms the basis both of Jewish, not surprisingly, after living in Egypt for that long. And this is the thing, you can't help that influence. You know, if God wasn't rescuing them for 418 years, why would God protect them from the influences of foreign religions? So there is that sense of, and it happens throughout. For many, they are the source of disease, sickness, natural disasters, and sort of forceful dominions around the world. So they are undergirding. So another answer is something that at one time, diseases like that or viruses. This is a challenge, to quite frankly, is from a scientific postmodern world where we have knowledge of how viruses work and we can see these things functioning. Is that just the biology? Well, yes, I think there's a way to reconcile that. Yes, it is biology. Yes, it is. You know, it's the spread of a virus, because that's where we are creatures that can, that this can happen to, and we can get the disease and it can affect us. And you can scientifically say A equals B equals C, and you can draw this line. But if you buy into the cosmology of angels and demons and the whole notion of them, then that means that if they have the capacity to control in the same way angels or celestial beings do, the molecular structures or forces or powers or diseases, and they're able to, then why not? In other words, one does not negate the other. One is assigned to operate in the same way. Blessings or health or healing or, and I don't know how much you all know about, have you ever heard of Reiki?
Yes.
Yeah, Reiki is I learned about it in my pastoral clinical education, and I it's the idea that when someone is sick, hey, you can move their energy of their body, and so you can move out bad energy. And I know people who are very committed Christians who dabble with, who are Reiki or whatever certified. I have kind of wrestled. I've never experienced it myself, so a lot of times knowledge is experiential. But I have heard testimony of people who do it, and if you're buying into the whole cosmology of celestial influence, then yeah, it makes it does. It's not out of the boundaries of this cosmology. Does that make sense? I mean, if we can manipulate energy and I think there was a point in history, and we don't have time to cover today, where we demonized, to just use a word that we're talking, the idea that the mystical world was still present, and in doing so, when we take away that element, then we do this modernity sort of sucks it out of it, and we find ourselves in a place where I think I've quoted that quote before: "A sky empty of angels leaves rooms for the intervention of astrologers." And so the idea is that our astrologers, which is now astronomers, right? Which do you look in the newspaper? Astrology. Yeah, the latter, the study of science, that it's a ball of gas. And what's interesting is we'll see that even in, so again, buying into the celestial notion that the sun and the moon and the stars are all actually celestial beings. They are the source of temptation throughout history. There's a strong emphasis on all temptations are evil forces, and there was even a point in history where the 7 deadly sins were associated with sort of the 7 dominions or powers. And honestly, I kind of buy into that a little bit. You think about greed and lust and pride, and some of these things that have just driven culture in an evil way for so long. Why not? Why wouldn't there be things that are affecting this? Is it just as the natural flow, or is it a spiritual reality? The implication, though, that I think is interesting about that is that if we buy into the idea that demons or actual spiritual beings can tempt us and influence us, and I mean, it makes sense because Jesus says, if you resist the temptations of the devil, he will flee, or the accuser, he will flee. And so there's some sense of there's boundaries, and rebuke in the name of Jesus, and then all this sort of stuff. And if you really buy into the cosmology of that, then if there are demons that are actual, not just like non-physical beings, but that doesn't mean they don't have form. It just means they don't have form in our world, that are trying to lead and lure. And so I don't know if there's like a prideful or lustful or greedy spirit that kind of hovers around people that, but you meet sometimes people and there's a spirit of greed, or there's a spirit of lust, or there's a spirit of whatever. But the idea that demons have that influence both over in other words, they can't make the decision for us. They can't make us do something. There's still that nature of will, of choice. But that means that there theoretically could be a spirit world that is coming at us and pulling us. And maybe once we find our rhythm of our own, they let us alone because we found our own patterns as animals. But at the same time, there's the idea that if we can both be tempted, that means our emotions, our intellect, our perception, who we are can be influenced by these evil forces. Again, all the more reason why we claim to be have the Spirit of God in us, and that sense of putting on the full armor of God, all of a sudden takes a whole new sense of like, we're spiritual warfare every day. I know that's out of thinking for many. The occult, even if you look at occultism, which I did a little bit, was brought in a lot of the ideas that, or
or emphasized. I went that way not long ago, so I wonder if they're It's gone over, maybe. Let's hope so. But occultism promoted the idea that spirits are the spirits they have the capacity to possess. So, in other words, occultists believe that we actually have the power to it's not like just the devil has the power to control the demons, but that we actually, by being in touch with these, have the ability to manipulate them. And that also but that it also buys into the idea that a demon or an evil spirit can possess us, and also that it can be conjured or called. So when you take the whole idea of what occultists believe, it means that they can conjure up a spirit, that they can control that spirit, and they can allow that spirit to possess them. Now, that's some scary stuff when you start to think about it. And it's not, and I don't say that lightly. I say that because I do think as Christians, we're called to make sure that we approach these things in a very respectful, delicate manner with a boldness of who we are and who we've been claimed to as children of God, to understand them. But at the same time, as you start to dig around in some of this, it gets, because if you buy into the spirit world, it has its place.
Faust isn't too far off.
What's that?
Faust is
No, probably not. The other thing to know as we go in is that the idea of a demon has not always been one of negativity or sinister nature. I'm not even going to try to say the word. And then originally the Greek diamono, or diamon, is the spirit or the divine power. And the reason that we draw from that comes from actually Plato's writings under Socrates about the idea of a spirit influencing, but it's not an evil spirit. It's not a sinister spirit. And in fact, there's a Greek term, eudaimonia, which contains that, and that means good spiritedness. And philosophy has a whole category that deals with eudaimonia, and it's the idea of how do we flourish as humans? How do we find happiness? So the idea of the spirit originally, and this has great influence actually even on early Judaism, because they didn't view the use of the word demon or spirit was not viewed in a negative way. And in fact, there's a stronger case in the Old Testament for the spirit being the spirit that we'd call the spirit of destruction, or a spirit of what seems like spirit of evil. The accuser would almost be a direct minion or a messenger or executor of God, not of its own source. So let's skip over then, and not in my notes, skip over those notes to you. To answer, to look at that, to say, well, where do these demons come from? Just from a biblical perspective, sort of looking back, you go back and biblically there is a major influence through the idea of Egyptian watchers. And if I'm going to go back to my notes here. Egyptian watchers were Egyptian sort of demonology. Ancient Egyptian demonology had two categories for demons. One was the guardians, and they were bound to a location. They were protectors of the underworld, and they were unmovable. So they were it's like zone defense in basketball. You have to stay in your area and cover that area. But they were protecting the portholes to the underworld. And the cosmology at that time said that the farther you're away from God, the divine God, which was in heaven, or in the skies, the farther away you were, which is where you get the idea that demons lived in the earth. And so the idea, when you strip away all the things that we know, and you have this evil force, and if the sun is the source of light and hope and life, then what is under the ground that you can't see, that is scary, becomes a source of darkness. So you have this developing cosmology that even affects us today, and how we understand. If I say, where's hell, you may not actually have a location in the cosmos, but what you're definitely thinking is down.
Yes.
And where's heaven? Up. So that you can see those things, how they influence us over time.
So you're saying that came from the Egyptians?
That originally, the sort of background of that idea that the demons were living in the ground or were protectors of the underground.
That didn't come from the Bible.
No, not really. In fact, the Bible would probably more argue that demons roam the earth in the same way we do, and we're cast down. But even that, the Bible doesn't really give us much. Again, a lot of our demonology comes from the books of the Apocrypha that and through the Roman Catholic Church. But because they culturally influence us, we just sort of see them as normative, but they're not. I mean, they're not really biblical. The second category of Egyptian demons are wanderers, and they are the ones that you would associate with the evil spirit, those two that possess. So they're the possessors or the mental illness. They're the ones who bring death. They're the ones who have communal diseases, and they're ones who create chaos. So the spirits or the demons that perhaps would be equivalent to the ones that were the pigs that Jesus cast out. They actually, now that I think about it, as I use that example, they actually might have been unmovable ones and were looking for to stay in that location. So they're saying, don't cast us out into existence, but cast us locally. I don't know. But the idea of the wanderers are the ones that sort of are moving around doing the bidding. So the two categories for Egyptians were the demons that stayed in a location to protect places of evil or cause evil. They were assigned to a location, and wanderers. From that, though, when we look at the biblical account, if someone wants to look up Genesis 6, and then the verses 4 through 5. Anyone can start reading. First person to get there.
4.
Genesis 6, 4 through 5.
The Nephilim were on the earth.
Nephilim. Yeah.
Nephilim, thank you. Were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that very intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
So this, for some theologians, they believe, and in Jewish mythology, this was also there, that this was the origin of sin, that sin didn't actually enter the world in the same way that we understand it. And fallenness happened, but sin entered the world in a new manifestation when the passage that says the sons of God came down and had relations with the daughters of the earth, as you just read, that they produced this race called the Nephilim, and they were giant. The word actually means fallen or fallen, but they were giants. Some assign them as being fallen angels. And if we look in if someone wants to look it up, Numbers 13:33 is when the Israelites were making their way into Canaan, and these were these giants that they had to battle against who were present in Canaan. The word also appears in Ezekiel 32:27, and it's translated as the fallen, not necessary to look up. But this passage of the Nephilim is where we get much of our understanding, believe it or not, in terms of the origin of sin, not necessarily, or the manifestation of sin. Now, you've heard me talk about this passage. I actually am not, just to step into my own voice here, I don't buy this totally, because I really like again, it's a cosmology, and I'm not saying I'm rejecting it. It could change a lot of things for me, but I'm kind of wrestling with it just because I think the idea of angelic beings taking human form and then this is like, animated cartoon sort of stuff in our heads of the idea of these angels from heaven coming down, or these angelic beings coming down, somehow materializing within and then giving birth to a half human, half divine or demigod, basically, yes. And so I'm challenged. I just got to say, in terms of, I'm going into a lot of the angelology that we've been looking at, but this is a bit of a challenge and a stretch for me. But saying that, for some, this is where it originated. Enoch, a book of the Apocrypha, also echoes this idea that sin originated with the angel-human convergence genetically. And for others that then from this, and also in Enoch, the Nephilim then give rise to evil spirits, and these evil spirits then become basically the gods of other nations.
But are they angels or are they demons?
So there's
It's,
They're evil.
what's that?
no, it says sons of God.
Yeah, I know what, and this is what's that?
I'm sorry, I was saying, answering you, if sons of God to me would be angels, not demons.
So
Am I right?
Then
Why
where did the
can't-
sin come from?
From that act of procreation, and it was birthed with that new race, the Nephilim.
Mine says they're sons of God's plural, small g s. So that doesn't sound like
Sons of
sons of
small g.
our God.
Huh. Sons of God.
It's
What version is that?
New English.
Okay, I don't know. I'd have to look at that. Here's the thing: is that maybe they're angels, maybe they're not. I don't know. It kind of messes. You don't know this. My cosmology says that those were evolved humans. The sons of God were the offspring of Adam and Eve, and the daughters of the earth were the Neanderthal people, in that they joined, because it allows me to reconcile evolution. But anyway, yeah, we'll save that for another day. I think we recorded that session. But Numbers 13:33, did anyone look that up? Just since I think someone, if you didn't, don't. It just mentions that they were present in Canaan. But anyway, the Nephilim gave rise to evil spirits, and out of these evil spirits came demons. Now, we don't always look at that. If someone wants to actually look up Revelation 12, it's always a race. Revelations 12:4-9.
this is where we're getting problems with translations and how many different times things have been translated and how many different languages and how you can't always literally translate them. I'm like,
No.
no.
Nope. And then how do you build any sort of belief system off of
Right.
inconsistencies
So,
throughout the whole thing? Well, maybe because belief ought to be focused more on the essentials and less on the specifics. And I
The
think that
bigger picture.
it is, and I think that for whatever reason in our culture, we often seek out to divide ourselves and tribalize ourselves over here rather than,
Mhm.
you know,
Well, yeah.
we're getting there though.
But I think, to me, that's unfortunate. Separating by little details that really can't be proven.
Especially these. And honestly, actually, the Roman Catholic Church, in terms of our own Christianity and even Protestantism, has influenced more of our, our image of what angels and demons are, whether or not we want to admit it. Because the Roman Catholic Church then influenced media and culture throughout Western Europe, and then that transferred over to the U.S. and just carried on. But go ahead if you have it.
So
It's very
yeah.
Yeah.
Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky. and
Okay, pause for a second right there. Its tail,
Its
talking
tail.
about the great red dragon swept. So this is a third. Now, if you buy into the celestial idea that the divine council was a bunch of stars and that they're celestial beings, that means that take that metaphor and put that on this passage in Revelations where took a third of the
third
stars.
of the stars
Carry on.
out of the sky and threw them down to the earth. It stood in front of the woman who was ready to give birth to the baby. It wanted to eat the woman's baby as soon as it was born. You want me to keep going on?
What verse are you on?
5 is the next one.
Yeah, keep going to 9.
The woman gave birth to a son who would rule all the nations with an iron rod.
Obviously, Jesus.
And her child was taken up to God and to his throne. The woman
Ascension.
ran away into the desert to a place that God had prepared for her. There she would be taken care of for 1,260 days.
I'll pause also a interesting theology of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
We won't get into that now.
Okay. Then there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and its angels fought back, but they were not strong enough. The dragon and its angels lost their place in heaven. It was thrown down out of heaven. This giant dragon is that old snake, the one called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world into the wrong way. The dragon and its angels were thrown to the earth.
So is that 9 or are you on 8?
That's
It's 9.
nine.
Okay,
That
so
was 9.
That was 9. So there you go.
that's our cosmology.
So
They
this
got through
is
all the
where-
angels down.
Yeah, I think last week when I was telling you, I had always believed that the devil was an archangel that had been thrown out of heaven. And I think this is where that belief had come from.
Well, that and just culture as a whole
Yeah.
probably gave that to you. I think
Yeah.
supported that idea that, I mean, by this point, by the time in most of our lifetimes, the devil has been personified as a fallen angel that was prideful and wanted to be like God.
Right.
So this is, again, it's a narrative we've pieced together, but it's one that we all sort of have commonplace belief. But the other thing I want to point out about that is not only were a third of the stars swept, and I have the idea that those are actually celestial beings, then again,
On Earth,
but
on Earth.
it is, and then you have this cosmic battle. And so the question though becomes is this is meant to be almost a prophecy of that is yet what is yet to come, not a narrative of explaining what happened before the existence of humanity or the world.
Why
or
do
the,
you say that?
well, because what he's talking about end times, he's talking about
It's used in
the
past
cosmic
tense.
battle. What's that?
It's used in past
Well,
tense.
well, let me, can I see that?
Yeah, it says, but they were not strong enough.
Maybe he is talking about
But
it.
it's talking about the vision. It's referring to the visions.
Yeah, and this is not, the cosmology of this is not meant to describe the birth, but it's meant to describe, I mean, it's kind of a larger picture, but it's a metaphor of the whole. Obviously, if the dragon's coming down, the baby's been born, the baby's gone up, or whatever it is, the child's gone up, then the time sequence isn't quite the same. But the idea, though, is this is where we get our understanding of then the Satan and his demons or his devils, or in this way, angels, fallen angels, are cast down to the earth. And so why are they on this earth? Well, there is your biblical between this. And the other one is that the relation to what we know is that the Matthew 25:41 that says that demons the destination is eternal fire. And then the demons that Jesus are going to cast out have knowledge of where. They say they don't Matthew 8:29, or maybe it's 28, I don't remember. Basically says, don't cast us, don't destroy us, don't send us to our end. So they know that there is a knowledge within the demonic world that their time has a clock on it. There's an end, and they know that the end will end in there. But they also know that they have dominion and purpose, or not necessarily dominion now, but they have purpose and agency in this world. But then in the end, that they will face a final judgment. So that's kind of the origin story. I mean, other cultures have original origin stories of where they came from, but in terms of our biblical proof, we really only have this reference to the Nephilim. We have the presence of the Nephilim and Numbers. We have the idea of the fallen ones in Ezekiel, and you have this passage in Revelation. That's really not a lot to go on. So.
Is there scripture that says an angel rebelled?
Not in the canon necessarily. There's allusions to that in the Apocrypha, but I don't know the references. Again, much of this stuff comes from the Apocrypha, but again, the Roman Catholic Church accepted the Apocrypha was accepted, as it was canonized in the first, 500 years of the history of the church. And the Western Church is what it was, or the Latin Church, which eventually became the Roman Catholic Church, to find all of that. And so if the canonical books for 1500 years included the Apocrypha, or maybe 1200 years or something, it's not surprising that it gets into the mindset or the psyche of the individual regardless. And even though we chop those books out, our imagery of what these things are still informed by them.
What about Martin Luther's, hymn that he wrote, and he said, the world is full of devils, but a mighty fortress is our God.
Mm-hmm.
And we're fighting the devils. That's what that.
Well, that's funny, and I
is
didn't write it down, but there was something about the German language and the way it translated devil. And let's look at that now, because actually I'm going to give you a little overview of how it transitioned. Demonology, the idea again of demons were not present in Judaism. The idea of this sort of evil spirit in the same way we imagine them. There were false gods. There were, and then that's not to say they didn't have power. They weren't discrediting evil spirits. They just didn't have the notion of demons that we have. So the challenge of us looking back into passages of scripture, we put our modern mindset or understanding, even though they were culturally shaped, onto those things. There was a period, as you know, when Israel ended up in exile, and they were taken into the sort of Mesopotamian Persian region. And during that time, this is when the story of Esther would have come out. And during that time, I got way too many notes here to talk about. During that time, the influence of the Persians' understanding of, or that region's understanding of the cosmology of the world, again, naturally is going to influence. You got a people who are broken, who have sort of abandoned Judaism. They're kind of loosely there. They're ethnically Jewish. And this is part of the recovery when they go back and when they go back to rebuild the temple after they've been freed. But during this time, you have this massive influence, and that Zoroastrian influence that also draws its influences from Hinduism originally. So if you want to look at the very birth of religion, you kind of have two. You have Hinduism, you have a polytheistic sort of vision of the world that eventually split east and west. Going west was sort of Greek mythology, going east was Hinduism. Out of Hinduism, you have Buddhism and other Eastern religions, sort of Taoism come out of that. And out of Greek mythology, you have a polytheism that spreads throughout. And so the earliest forms of ancient Near East religion would have viewed the world as a polytheistic world, lots of gods. This is, again, what makes Israel's claim to one God overall so radical in a world system that acknowledges other gods, just doesn't claim to be the only God. So it's sort of a trumping of the whole thing. But this idea then of the influence, once they come out of monotheism, this sense of this other figure comes from the Hindu god pantheon through the Zoroastrian god of Devia. And this is the idea of an evil force that is personified as a cosmic battle against a sort of divine being. In that, there were two classes of demons that we see in the Old Testament. The first is Leviticus 17:7, which references a goat. And that's thought to have drawn from other nations, their sort of image of the evil force. And that's where you get the pentagram sort of idea of the goat in the head. And that was a strong Assyrian influence. The other one is the idea of the foreign gods were deities unto themselves. And you see that in Psalms 106 and Deuteronomy 32. But other than that, that's the influence of that region, and the idea that there is the idea that Judaism, that there is a evil demon or force, really comes into play during that period of exile. As it moves through Judaism and eventually gets to Christianity, and it moves towards the beginning of the New Testament, they started to understand daemon, the word, as being associated with evil spirits. It was viewed in the New Testament and early church times, as they walked around the cities that were established by the Greeks, as the statues of pagan gods, as being actually embodied spirits. So there was this stay away from those statues. They were the housing for them. During the Byzantine era, roughly between the 5th and the 15th century, that was the predominant view of Christianity, that these demons were that there was evil forces in these, and they, if you got too close to them, they could have influence. When the Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century BC, it translated the Hebrew words for demon from just a spirit into a evil spirit. And so then you see right there, from just a single translation choice where all of a sudden you have this massive shift in how they understand spirits. So then all of a sudden the New Testament church, now not surprising with the onset of Pentecost and a more spirit-oriented world, but that would influence. And again, that's a case of popular culture influencing interpretation. So we as postmodern Christians in a postmodern Western world can look and say, hey, look at all these places where the popular cultural sort of influence played a major role in shaping the ideology or cosmology of claim to be, believers and committed to Christ. So I just want to pause there for a second. What does it say about us?
We're lemmings.
Well, I mean, we're,
Well, it's kind of disturbing because it's saying that so much of, at least in the New Testament, so much of what our beliefs are could have been something completely different. We just believe because of whatever the influence of the time, whatever civilization was powerful at the time.
Yeah.
And if it had been a different civilization, we might believe something totally different because the Bible would tell us something different.
It's cultural rather than inspired.
Well,
It's a little disturbing.
Well, not only that, but even with our understanding of evil forces, we most of us, I think, we would say, that you're not denying their existence.
But don't we have a kind of fascination with them? I have never understood the idea of decorating for Halloween by putting images of gruesome demons and devils and ugliness in your front yard. I don't get that. Why are we so fascinated with that?
Let's do a Bible study on that,
Yes.
because I have some opinions on.
Before
Well, yes. Well, I'll just say to you right now, and then we'll talk about it later. I don't celebrate. I haven't celebrated. I researched Halloween many moons ago in seminary, and after reading, I decided I didn't want to have any
It's
part.
pagan.
It's
all pagan.
But we love it.
So-
I mean,
No, let's save it.
Yeah, I
So,
know where
Yeah.
you're going.
so let me throw this out there. What is the definition of evil?
That I would say that which opposes God. But and hold on to that thought. What I want to say is that I want you to realize is that even with the cosmology, that there's a real devil or a real evil force, and that there's a cosmic warfare. The question really comes down to, what does that mean? Are we as our cultural influence is one that's sort of just spirit world, whatever. It's not, it doesn't affect us on a daily basis. Oh, and so my point in saying that is, even with the knowledge, biblically and historically, culturally informed of what these evil forces are and how they came into being and how they exist, and we have our folklore around that, we still on a daily basis, how often do you think about a evil spirit? Not
I
often.
think it's part of entertainment in the country.
Well, yes, we've probably trivialized it in some way by making it a source of entertainment.
Around people that think about it a lot.
I was gonna say,
No,
I
I'm
read
sure there
the
are
news
some.
now.
I was gonna say, if you watch the news, it's a lot.
But when you see but here's the thing, the difference is you see the news and you see travesties. The question is do you see travesties or do you see evil forces coveting those things?
I see.
Charles Manson was, to
My
me, the devil.
Oh, yeah, maybe manifested.
They give evils, the devil and evil spirits, the same attributes as God. And they seem to think that they know everything. They know your thoughts.
But that's just ignorance to
I know, but
the.
this is what I see, and to me, they just don't realize that God is the only one that
Oh,
has
no.
those powers.
Yeah.
And that we don't have to fear them, because they get really fearful about it.
Absolutely.
And all those books that were written in the 70s and the 80s, I forgot who wrote all those things. I mean, those were really scary.
Jesus talked
Yeah.
about the devil a lot. He had a lot of interaction.
Well,
with
even but
devil.
the devil is a translation choice too, and I think a lot of times when he says Satan, he's talking about accuser, and then it goes back to the question of whether or not he was actually referring to a figure of Satan or whether an accusing class of demonic forces. Because that's pretty rough. If Jesus was talking to Peter and saying, "Get behind me, Satan," like was Jesus, the Son of God, really calling Peter the Satan, the Prince of Darkness? I mean, this is one of those categories where, Yeah, well, and when you put it in that term, when those terminology, it gets that's a pretty weighty accusation. So Ben, and then I'm going to say a few closing remarks. Because
Okay, I'm just going to say quickly that you talk about the accuser, and I never ever thought of that before, and I've been thinking since last week. I went through a period shortly after Vietnam with a lot of self-doubt and things, and then got married and raising kids and career and all that kind of stuff. And then when I retired, I was thinking again, and I went to my pastor and I said, I'm really struggling with this. I feel I'm, deep down evil,
yeah,
and she basically said, get thee away from me, Satan. She said, pray like that, get away. And I'm darned if it didn't work.
Yeah.
But he was putting thoughts in my mind about how, and if I that evil then, what could I do now?
Yeah.
I mean, it was almost feel like being possessed.
Well, and honestly, I mean, some will say that, and I think we can look at something like bipolarity. I mean, and I have one of my closest friends is bipolar, and he describes it as sometimes when he's manic or when he feels like he's got a demon in him. And then the side of it, we know that there's a chemical sort of understanding of what's happening in his body to some extent. But again, these are two worlds that don't have to be in conflict, only when we put them in conflict, because you can still see movement and influence from a spiritual world within the science of the world we live in. And again, this would be the same thing for truth. I would argue for evolution and creation. We want to make them battle, but they don't have to. And in a world where these things don't battle, you actually see a more seamless world between. And this is what makes Halloween so dangerous, in my opinion, is it's the one darkest night of the night where they're trying to conjure up spirits. So in the end, what I want to say is this: demons are a amorphous category that throughout the history of time have changed and been understood, starting with more of a neutral, just sort of spirit, and over time in history being sort of transformed into the personification of evil, and then placed eventually through different times in our history in a category or a hierarchy of evil that are probably demons, are probably the most basic level, if you will. In the same way angels actually are. Angels are considered the on the ground sort of. There is still some idea of angels being wanderers or ones that are watchers that stay and that guard spaces. We don't really have, again, we don't think about the abyss. We don't think about, we know the word is, the world has a magma core, not that it has demons down there. But again, if angels can embody the sun and the moon, why couldn't demons or evil forces embody the magma? I mean, I'm really to the point after looking at all this stuff where I'm not ready to dismiss any of it.
How do angels embody the sun and the moon? That sounds crazy.
Which says that God put the sun and the moon and placed the heavenly host to govern the earth. And so the idea of the governing is an action in Hebrew that was assigned to a being, not a reformed interpretation, perhaps, of that might be, if you want to take some of the angel mysticism out of it, would be that God set it in motion, and the elements of the natural world are what you're guiding it. But then from a more mystical perspective, those elements are guided by celestial beings. It's not an easy thing to understand. I mean, there are just the amount of information on demons in terms of the different cultures. But what you do see in all of them is that eventually we get to the place where demons are looked at as being evil or malevolent or trying to cause mischief. They're the ones tempters. They're the ones drawing away. And we in our Hellenized Christianity want to look at God and sort of ascribe this perfection to God. And so everything that is pulling us away from God is assigned to this category of evil. What is sin? Sin is the opposite of God's will. What is evil? That which opposes God. But that doesn't take into account always that God uses maybe evil forces or a spirit of destruction to carry out his will. Now, what does that mean for us? I think in a very practical way, I think that we ought to have a great respect for the spiritual world. And I think that to disrespect the spiritual world is a dangerous, dangerous play. And I think that we can have respect with a sense of confidence because we've been claimed as children of God. And we know that, yes, we do have the power, if we are operating and functioning in the spirit, to rebuke evil forces and spirits. And I do think that's probably one of the most powerful things we can do in times of depression or in times of anger, in times of, is to recognize that
there could be forces that are attacking us. Maybe not. Maybe they've just wound us up to the point where we're so numb to the fact that they aren't, that they're there, that they don't even have to do much to tip us in one direction. And that also, evil forces don't just come into play when we feel malice or anger or depression. They also would then therefore be the source of anything that is opposed to a sense of balance. So they would be things like gluttony and greed and lust and or some of the other, jealousy and all these things that turn us against one another and bring about darkness are things that spirit world is engaging in. I don't want to claim in my own Christian demonology, as I've studied some of this, I don't want to claim a tier or a rank because I don't think there's enough sufficient evidence to do so. And I don't want to take some of my social cues from literature throughout the history. So I'm happy to rest in the idea that there is a spirit world out there, that spirit world has a division between those forces that are evil and those forces that are at the bidding of God and are good. Good being a relative term for us, good and evil. And that, again, we ought to respect them, but that we also always have to remember that if we truly have the assurance of the Spirit that we are children of God, that there is nothing that the evil forces can do to overtake
And we
us.
shouldn't dwell.
Right.
We
It
may,
gives them power.
yeah, we may recognize that they may exist, but I don't think it's something you dwell on in your everyday life.
No, it isn't, but it's also something I would say that we shouldn't turn a blind eye to. And when we see depression, I think that our prayers, if you buy into it, then the prayers become protect. I'm sending my son off to school, and my prayer is one of protection. Because
from evil.
Because I know that there are forces that seek to shape and corrupt and manipulate and I want to, and so I am buying into the world, but I also believe that in the end the victory is God's. So
When I was a teenager, I said to my pastor, I don't believe in the devil. And he said to me, Jesus.
Yeah.
And that made me think, I better re-examine this. And then he also said Martin Luther did. And then I studied the hymn, Mighty Fortress is Our God. But it says that we should